At 11:43 a.m. on May 29, 1943, a chill wind swept across the hardstand at RAF Alconbury and carried the smell of spilled aviation fuel and damp grass. Sergeant Robert H. Doolin pulled his leather flight jacket tight around his shoulders as he approached the unfamiliar shape of the gunship he would fly that day. The aircraft before him looked like a B-17, yet bristled with more firepower than any bomber he had ever seen. Twin .50 caliber guns protruded from staggered waist windows, a second dorsal turret rose like a hump behind the radio room, and a bulbous turret glinted under the nose where a bombardier's glass would normally be. Doolin had flown as a radio operator and gunner on standard flying fortresses for months, but this mission was different. The Army Air Forces had modified 13 B-17Fs into experimental escort bombers called YB-40S and sent 12 of them to the 327th Bomb Squadron of the 92nd Bomb Group for combat testing. One of them was serial number 42-5738, nicknamed Boston Tea Party and coded UX-G, and it would be Doolin's home for the next 8 hours. He climbed the crew ladder and felt the weight of his Mae West life vest and parachute harness pulling on his shoulders as he ducked into the radio room, noting the extra ammunition boxes that filled the space where spare parachutes normally hung. The pilot, First Lieutenant Hans Johnson, already sat in the left seat running through the engine start checklist. He looked younger than his 24 years in the dim light, but his voice was steady as he coordinated with his co-pilot and engineer to bring the 4 Wright Cyclone engines to life. Outside, ground crews finished loading over 11,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition into magazines that stretched along the belly, where bombs would normally ride. The YB-40 carried nearly triple the ammunition of a standard B-17F and weighed about 4,000 pounds more. As the engines settled into a throbbing idle, Doolin plugged in his headset and strapped into his radio operator's chair, surrounded by equipment that crackled and hummed with energy. The smell of hot oil and exhaust filled the cabin as cold rain began to fall, speckling the glass and making the world outside gray and indistinct. In the shadows of the dispersal bay, Ground Crew Chief Sergeant Joe Walker wiped grease from his hands and slapped the fuselage with affection. He told Doolin this new flying fortress would either change the war or break his back. The gusting wind carried distant voices as other crews loaded their maps and flew through checklists. A clock on the instrument panel ticked toward the brief departure time, each second stretching like an eternity. Doolin took a deep breath, tasting cold oil and rain, and thought about his family far across the Atlantic. He had volunteered for radio school to avoid being drafted into infantry, yet now found himself heading straight into the jaws of the Luftwaffe. They were scheduled to join more than 160 bombers bound for the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire on the French coast. It would be the first combat test of the flying destroyer concept, and Doolin felt both pride and anxiety as he watched the other 6 gunships taxi into position behind them. At 1:20 p.m., tower control cleared them for takeoff, and Johnson pushed the throttles forward, feeling the heavy aircraft rumble down the wet runway. The YB-40's nose turret swiveled as the gunner tested his field of fire, and the extra dorsal turret rotated smoothly, but the weight of the ammunition and armor plating was evident in the sluggish acceleration. They lifted off and clawed for altitude at a climbing rate far slower than Doolin was used to. A standard B-17 could reach 20,000 feet in 25 minutes. The YB-40 took nearly double that time. Their formation set course across the channel, engines droning, and the cold seeped through every seam in the fuselage. Doolin checked his radio equipment, listened to the chatter on the command frequency, and thought about the lives they were meant to protect. In the months before this mission, the 8th Air Force had suffered catastrophic losses as bombers ventured deep into occupied Europe without fighter escorts. German pilots in Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s exploited gaps in the B-17's defenses, diving through formations and picking off stragglers. Crews called the return leg running the gauntlet. Between February and May 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 173 flying fortresses over Europe, and morale sagged as crews realized their odds of completing a 25 mission tour were slim. Lacking long-range fighters to accompany the bombers all the way to Germany and back, commanders and engineers looked for another solution. That solution was now droning through icy air and humming with the energy of 16.50 caliber machine guns. Doolin's eyes wandered over the patchwork of metal and plexiglass, the rivets and seams that held their world together, and he wondered how many enemy fighters it would take to test those guns. Ahead of him in the radio room, belts of ammunition snaked toward the chin turret under the bombardier's position. Instead of a bomb sight, the nose now housed a remote-controlled turret with 2 guns that could track incoming fighters dead ahead, an innovation developed by Bendix and installed on the YB-40 as a key experiment. The second dorsal turret behind the radio room added yet another pair of guns, and twin mounts replaced the single waist guns that had proven inadequate in earlier battles. Additional armor plate protected crew positions, making the aircraft feel like a flying fortress within a fortress. As they approached the French coast, flak bursts blossomed like dirty flowers against the overcast sky. The formation tightened, and Doolin could hear the voice of Major William Reed, the group operations officer, over the intercom, reminding crews to maintain spacing and watch for fighters. Aboard Boston Tea Party, everyone seemed acutely aware of the extra weight and drag. The flight engineer reported higher fuel consumption, and the engines strained to maintain their place in formation. Outside, the cold wind moaned through the open waist windows, carrying the acrid scent of cordite from the test-fired guns and the sweet smell of the chewing gum Doolin used to keep his ears clear. Their target came into view around 4 p.m., a sprawling complex of reinforced concrete pens where U-boats sheltered beneath heavy roofs. The lead bomber dropped flares to mark the run, and each squadron peeled off in succession, bombs falling in a long ribbon toward the pens, shaking the formation as flak erupted. Because the gunships carried no bombs, they held station while the bombers released their loads, then prepared to accompany them back across the channel. For a brief moment, there was a sense of relief. No fighters had yet appeared, and perhaps the YB-40's reputation had preceded it. But as the lighter bombers banked and climbed, relieved of thousands of pounds of bombs, the escort aircraft began to reveal their Achilles heel. Boston Tea Party strained to keep up, burning fuel and heating its engines to dangerous limits as the formation speed increased. Doolin heard Johnson call the engineer to check cylinder head temperatures. Number 3 engine was running hot, and they had to pull back power to avoid damage. The speed difference grew from a few miles per hour to a dozen, and soon the YB-40 was sliding toward the rear of the formation, exactly where German fighters loved to hunt. At 4:30 p.m., contrails appeared high, and to the east, a cluster of Focke-Wulf 1-9s were diving to intercept. Johnson called fighters, 11 o'clock high, over the intercom, and gunners rotated their turrets, pulling triggers as soon as the Germans entered range. The forward turret spat a stream of tracers toward the lead Focke-Wulf, and Doolin watched through his small side window as the German pilot broke away before firing. Another attacker dove from the rear but broke off after the twin dorsal turrets stitched the sky with lead. For a few minutes, the overlapping fields of fire did exactly what engineers had promised. Then, reality set in. The main bomber stream continued to pull away, leaving the lumbering gunships exposed. Doolin could see the gap widening, measured in miles and minutes, and he could feel the tension rising as the German pilots wheeled around for another try. For 6 minutes, the YB-40's guns kept the fighters at bay, but the heavy aircraft lost ground with each passing second. The nose gunner called out another attack, and the tail gunner replied with the steady staccato of his twin .5s. Smoke trailed from a damaged German engine, but 2 more fighters appeared off the right wing. By 4:45 p.m., Boston Tea Party and another gunship, codenamed Guardian Angel, were isolated 5 miles behind the main formation. The Germans recognized the vulnerability and pressed home their attacks, weaving and jinking to avoid the hail of bullets. 120mm shell punched through the right wing root, severing a hydraulic line and spraying fluid across the waist compartment. Doolin smelled the sharp scent of hydraulic oil and heard the waist gunner curse as he ducked to avoid the spray. The tail gunner reported that the right landing gear actuator was damaged, meaning they would have to crank the gear down by hand if they survived the day. At 5 p.m., 2 Mi-10-9s appeared from behind, using the setting sun to mask their approach. They dove to within 400 yards before opening fire, cannon shells tearing through fabric and metal. The YB-40's guns replied in a deafening chorus. Doolin felt the recoil through the airframe as 8 guns fired at once, but he also felt the aircraft shudder under the weight of its armor and ammunition. The Germans sheared away, one trailing black smoke, but more contrails appeared on the horizon, and the chase resumed. Through it all, Doolin kept sending and receiving radio messages, relaying position reports, and listening for friendly fighters. Sweat trickled down his neck despite the cold as he realized they might not have the fuel to make it home if they continued to burn at full power. Finally, at 5:20 p.m., 4 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts swooped into view from the northeast. Their distinctive radial engines and barrel-shaped fuselages brought a wave of relief as they dived toward the attacking German fighters. The Mi-10-9s and FW-19s 0S broke off and turned for France, unwilling to engage American fighters so close to the English Channel. Boston Tea Party and Guardian Angel formed a loose pair and turned toward the coast under P-47 escort, engines humming at maximum continuous power, fuel gauges dropping faster than comfortable. When they reached the coast, the P-47s peeled away to resume their sweep, and the two gunships made for home alone. At 6:18 p.m., Johnson cranked the right landing gear down using the emergency handle, while the engineer pumped the brakes manually. The gear locked with seconds to spare, and Boston Tea Party touched down at Alconbury, heavy and wounded. Ground crews counted 16 bullet holes, a severed hydraulic line, and a bent trim tab. Johnson shook his head and told Colonel Reed the obvious. The gunship couldn't keep up. Reed ordered them to fly again, hoping the first mission was an anomaly, but Doolin sensed that the dream of a heavily armed escort bomber was already unraveling. Why would an airplane designed to protect other bombers become the target of German fighters? That question hung in the cool evening air as crews debriefed and engineers pored over data, and it would soon define the short, turbulent life of the YB-40. Inside, the fuselage condensation formed on cold metal surfaces and dripped onto ammunition belts, making hands slick and cold. Doolin wiped his gloves on his trousers and double-checked the frequency settings on his radios. The intercom crackled with clipped voices, pilot commands, gunner reports, navigator bearings, and occasional jokes to relieve tension. A veteran waist gunner named Sergeant Sam Wilson sang a few bars of a blues tune until laughter broke the stress. When the first FW-190 appeared head-on, Doolin's heart raced as he watched the chin turret track it with mechanical grace. The twin Brownings belched fire, and he felt a savage satisfaction when the fighter pulled away, trailing smoke. As the gap widened, the navigator leaned forward to peer out of the small dome window, calculating ground speed and time to the coast. He pointed out landmarks on the map, even though clouds obscured most features. When the P-47s arrived, one pilot waggled his wings and gave a thumbs up through his canopy. A brief, human connection in a mechanical world. Doolin felt a surge of gratitude. The escort fighters looked like angels, painted in olive drab. In the spring of 1943, the stakes for Allied air power were at their highest. Long-range fighter escorts had yet to arrive in Europe, and the Luftwaffe's seasoned pilots were using frontal attacks to devastating effect, shooting down bombers faster than replacement crews could be trained. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a 4-engine heavy bomber with a crew of 10, had earned a reputation for toughness, but its forward defenses were weak. German pilots exploited this by diving head-on at closing speeds over 600 miles per hour. Gunners in cheek positions struggled to track such fast approaches, and the absence of a power-operated nose turret left the bombardier vulnerable. As early as August 1942, commanders demanded a way to defend bomber formations without relying on fighter cover that didn't exist. One idea was to take an existing bomber and cram it with guns and ammunition, creating a self-contained escort that could accompany the formation all the way to Germany and back. Engineers at Lockheed's Vega Division and Douglas Aircraft embraced the challenge. They removed the bombs and bomb sight from a B-17F and fitted a remote-controlled Bendix chin turret under the nose, added a second dorsal turret behind the bomb bay, replaced the single waist guns with twin mounts, restored cheek guns, and installed additional armor. The bomb bay became an ammunition magazine carrying 11,275 rounds, and the aircraft's gross weight increased to nearly 64,000 pounds, 4,000 more than a standard bomber. A prototype designated XB-40 flew on 10 November 1942, and an order for 13 service test aircraft followed, with Douglas and Tulsa completing the conversions by March 1943. The intent was simple. If fighters couldn't escort bombers, the bombers would escort themselves. Design meetings at Lockheed's plant in Burbank brought together engineers who normally designed airliners for civilian airlines. Now they were sketching gun placements and calculating weight distribution on blackboards, while coffee went cold and ashtrays filled. They debated whether to mount 20mm cannons like the Germans or rely on tried and true Browning .50s that crews already knew how to maintain. Ultimately, they chose to stick with the Brownings, reasoning that reliability and available ammunition trumped hitting power. The remote-controlled nose turret was a marvel of electromechanical engineering, with servo motors, gears, and cables, allowing the bombardier to aim with his feet and trigger with his hands. Testing at Wright Field showed that the turret could traverse 90 degrees in just a few seconds, tracking a closing fighter with surprising precision. Armament officers drafted new manuals describing how to stow belts of ammunition under catwalks and around bulkheads. Gunners rehearsed loading procedures in mock-ups, learning to feed rounds smoothly and clear jams under the vibration of flight. When the prototype XB-40 finally rolled out, Its unusual silhouette drew interest from generals who visited the factory to see progress. Photos sent to Washington showed the nose turret shining like a glass bubble and the twin dorsal turrets projecting menace. Crews trained at a gunnery school set up in Florida, firing from bluffs out over the Gulf of Mexico at towed targets. They learned to coordinate fire across multiple stations, using new call and response procedures to avoid overlapping fields that could damage their own aircraft. The Army Air Forces envisioned the YB-40 flying at the tail of each squadron, using its 16 guns to ward off fighters and protect the formation once bombs were dropped. On paper, the concept seemed sound. U.S. intelligence predicted that one gunship could provide the firepower of several bombers, and the psychological impact of such a flying destroyer might deter German pilots from attacking at all. Colonel William Reed, a veteran of early raids, championed the idea and oversaw the deployment of the gunships to his group at Alconbury. Crews nicknamed them Hedgehog, Woolaroc, Chicago, Plain Dealing Express, and Dolly Madison after the names painted on their noses, embracing the idea that these machines could change the balance of power. The modifications, however, altered the aircraft's center of gravity and aerodynamic profile. Engineers warned that the extra weight and drag would reduce climb rate and cruise speed, but there was no way to know how bad the problem would be until the YB-40 joined real combat formations. When the YB-40 project began, the 8th Air Force's strategy hinged on daylight precision bombing. Dozens of bombardment groups took off from bases across eastern England and converged into long columns stretching for miles. Each squadron assigned a specific altitude and position to minimize collisions and maximize defensive coverage. Fighter pilots like Adolf Galland and Walter Osaw studied these formations and developed coordinated attacks using 12 o'clock high and 6 o'clock low approaches. Without escort fighters to chase them away, German pilots could take their time choosing targets, often focusing on stragglers or low-flying elements where gunners' arcs of fire overlapped poorly. Casualty reports told a grim story. In March 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost 45 B-17 bombers and more than 450 airmen. By May, the cumulative losses threatened to halt the bombing campaign. Something had to change, and the YB-40 represented a bold experiment to buy time until long-range fighters could arrive. By spring 1943, the Allied strategic bombing campaign had become a battle of attrition unlike anything in aviation history. Every formation that took off from East Anglia represented millions of dollars in aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable men. Crews were required to fly 25 missions before rotating home, yet half never reached that number due to combat losses and accidents. Survival depended on teamwork, luck, and innovations that could change the odds even slightly. German radar stations along the French and Dutch coasts detected bomber streams hours before they arrived and directed fighters to intercept at precise points. Messerschmitts carried heavy cannons and armor-piercing rounds that could rip through aluminum skin like paper. Inside the 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe, generals pored over maps and casualty tables while weather officers stared at fronts moving across Europe. A mission delayed by weather might mean fewer losses, or might allow the Germans to reposition, and that uncertainty weighed heavily on planners. Late-night briefings displayed aerial photos taken by reconnaissance Spitfires, showing flak belts around industrial targets like Ruhr dams and ball-bearing plants. Each mission required navigating through mazes of anti-aircraft guns, smoke screens, and decoy fires set by German civil defense. The introduction of the YB-40 came at a time when Allied intelligence estimated that 10% of all crew positions were unfilled due to losses. Commanders hoped that saving even a handful of bombers per mission would translate into hundreds of lives over the course of the campaign. The concept also promised a psychological boost. If German pilots believed attacking a formation meant facing a wall of guns, they might hesitate or break off entirely. Morale on both sides was shaped not only by numbers, but by perception, and the YB-40 program aimed to exploit that fact. Robert Doolin and his crew trained intensively at Wright Field before crossing the Atlantic. They familiarized themselves with the new chin turrets controls, practiced loading 27-foot ammunition belts without kinks, and learned to coordinate fire between turrets to avoid hitting friendly aircraft. On the ground, the YB-40 drew curious stares from mechanics and visitors. Its twin mounts and bulging turrets made it look like a porcupine, bristling with guns that promised to protect, but also added enormous complexity and weight. Engineers trimmed weight where they could, even secretly removing some armor plating, as Doolin recalled later. Still, the gunship remained heavier than the standard bomber, and each crew member knew that returning to base would require more fuel and longer runways. After the first mission, the shortcomings were obvious to everyone involved. Colonel Reed insisted on another test on June 15th when 4 YB-40s joined a raid on Le Mans, but they again fell behind after the bomb drop, forcing escort fighters to shepherd them home. On June 22nd, 11 gunships participated in an attack on the synthetic rubber plant at Hulls. During that mission, 1 YB-40 was shot down by fighters as it lagged behind the formation. The loss shook the crews and confirmed the fear that a slow escort bomber could become a death trap. 2 days later, 7 gunships flew to Oldenburg, and again none could keep pace on the return leg. On June 28th, 6 YB-40s returned to Saint Nazaire with similar results. Multiple engine overheating issues and fuel consumption above planned levels plagued each flight, and pilots struggled to maneuver the heavy planes under attack. Doolin flew 7 missions aboard Boston Tea Party and each time experienced the same sinking feeling as the formation pulled away. The nose turret deterred frontal attacks at first, but once German pilots realized the gunships could not catch up, they circled and waited for the moment when the escorts were alone. On June 22nd, a YB-40 named Dakota Demon went down in flames after a sustained attack by FW-190s. All 10 crew members bailed out and became prisoners of war. The loss highlighted another issue. The YB-40's additional armor did not guarantee survival when fighters concentrated their fire on vulnerable fuel tanks and control surfaces. The mission to Le Mans on June 15th seemed routine by comparison to the first test. 4 gunships spread themselves through the formation, but as bombs fell on rail yards, the same physics punished them, and they fell behind after the turn. German fighters exploited the separation once more, circling like wolves, stalking a wounded bison. The gunships fired thousands of rounds, scoring hits, but exhausting ammunition stocks without being able to catch up. On June 22nd, the target was the synthetic rubber plant at Hulls, a complex crucial to Germany's tire production. 11 gunships joined this raid, their largest deployment, and the formation flew through thick black clouds of flak that sounded like gravel thrown against tin. As bombs fell through smoke, fighters dove out of the sun and singled out a YB-40 named Dakota Demon. Even with 16 guns blazing, the heavy escort could not outpace the attackers, and flames engulfed its wing before the crew bailed out. Watching a sister ship burn left the remaining crews shaken. They had imagined their armor would give them a chance to reach the channel. Instead, they saw how concentrated fire could overwhelm any defenses when speed was lacking. 2 days later, 7 gunships flew to bomb submarine yards at Oldenburg, enduring headwinds that slowed them further. One pilot described the experience as pushing a loaded cart uphill while being pelted with rocks. Attacks from above and below required constant vigilance as FW-190s made repeated passes, testing the overlapping arcs until they found blind spots. Crew coordination improved with practice, but mechanical fatigue increased with each mission. On June 26th, poor weather over Hamburg forced a recall, but the YB-40s still climbed to altitude and burned precious fuel before turning back. Returning without engaging the enemy left crews feeling drained and frustrated by wasted effort. The second attack on Saint Nazaire on June 28th saw only 6 gunships assigned, and once more they lagged far behind during the withdrawal. A YB-40 named Woolerock limped home with 2 engines sputtering, landing on the shortest runway it had ever attempted. On June 29th, the group attempted to strike another target in France, but the mission was aborted due to weather. The gunships returned to base heavy, with unspent ammunition and unbroken tension. By August, the crews returned from missions to find orders on the briefing room door declaring the end of the program. Some cheered, some felt deflated. All understood that the experiment had run its course. In letters home, men wrote about the strange contraption they had flown and the mixture of fear and pride it engendered. Years later, veterans would recall the YB-40 as a footnote in history, a curiosity with an outsized impact. Engineers attempted incremental fixes. They shifted ammunition forward to adjust the center of gravity, redesigned the ammunition feed chutes to reduce jams, and even modified the dorsal turrets to reduce drag. At Abbott's Ripton Depot, mechanics worked long nights to lighten the gunships without compromising their defensive capabilities, but the fundamental physics of weight and drag remained unforgiving. The aircraft simply could not climb or accelerate quickly enough once the formation's bombs were gone. By the end of June, frustration grew within the squadron. Pilots and gunners took pride in the firepower at their fingertips, but dreaded the moment when the lighter bombers would leave them behind. Morale suffered, as crews realized they were flying machines that could not fulfill their intended role. Colonel Reed and his staff compiled performance statistics after each mission. Out of 59 dispatches, only 48 sorties were credited due to turnbacks and aborts. The YB-40S claimed 5 enemy fighters destroyed and 2 probables, numbers that paled compared to the overall bomber losses in the same period. The analysis was clear. The gunships performed well in mid-mission defense when still with the formation, but their inability to rejoin after bomb release exposed them and negated any advantage. The extra guns had not reversed the attrition of bomber crews, and the cost in resources and risk could no longer be justified. When Colonel Reed presented his report to 8th Air Force Headquarters, he did not mince words. He noted that the gunship had performed as expected in terms of firepower, but failed in its primary mission because of its weight. Analysts compiled charts showing the average speed loss per minute once bombs were released and compared it to formation speeds. The gap grew so quickly that in 12 minutes the gunship was more than 5 miles behind, an eternity in aerial combat. Maintenance officers reported that the additional turrets and feeds increased downtime between missions, reducing the number of sorties per airframe. Hydraulic systems leaked, turrets jammed, and ammunition belts kinked under acceleration, all requiring hours of work to remedy. Pilots commented that landing with so much extra weight challenged airfields in England, some of which had shorter runways. Braking systems overheated, and one gunship overshot a runway, coming to rest in a field, though no injuries occurred. Strategists weighed the cost of continuing the program against the imminent arrival of P-51 Mustangs, which promised to escort bombers deep into Germany. The answer became clear. Resources should go toward fighter escort development rather than heavy escorts. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, approved the cancellation, but praised the creativity of engineers who had dared to try something new. He assured crews that their sacrifices were not in vain because they had proven that forward firepower could change the calculus of survival. For Doolin, the analysis confirmed what he had felt in his bones during each mission. The aircraft had been a noble attempt that could not overcome physics. He resolved to carry the lessons forward and to speak up if future innovations ignored the practical realities of combat. Around this time, long-range escort fighters began arriving in England. The P-47 Thunderbolt gained external fuel tanks that extended its range, and the first P-51B Mustangs with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines appeared in November 1943. These fighters could escort bomber streams deep into Germany and engage enemy fighters before they reached the formation, rendering the YB-40 concept obsolete almost overnight. In July, the remaining gunships flew a few more missions, including attacks on Bergen, Kassel, and Kiel, but none altered the verdict. On July 29th, 2 YB-40 escorts a raid on the submarine yards at Kiel, fell behind as usual, and landed at emergency fields short of their base. In August, General Carl Spaatz canceled the program, and by November, all 12 surviving YB-40s had been shipped back to the United States. Most were converted into TB-40 gunnery trainers, stripped of their extra turrets, and used to teach aerial gunners how to operate the new Chin turret. The YB-40 program cost around $469,000 per aircraft and delivered 20 airframes in total, including 4 trainers. It lasted just 3 months in combat and is often remembered as a failure, but its short life left a lasting legacy. In the aftermath of the program, engineers carefully studied the gunship's innovations. The Bendix nose turret that first bristled on the YB-40 became an icon of the B-17G, its rounded form appearing in countless photographs. Crews quickly learned to operate the remote sighting system, training new bombardiers to fight as gunners before focusing on bombs. The Chin turret's installation required repositioning the bombardier's console and adjusting the aircraft's nose weight, which inadvertently improved stability in turbulence. Pilots reported that the B-17G tracked more smoothly in formation, easing the workload on long missions. Staggered waist gun positions introduced by the YB-40 allowed gunners to swivel and fire independently without bumping elbows. This minor change increased engagement time and reduced the risk of hitting friendly aircraft during chaotic battles. The Cheyenne tail modification enlarged the windows and added a wraparound enclosure, enhancing situational awareness for the tail gunner. It also repositioned the guns to give a slightly higher firing angle, catching fighters attempting to climb under the tail. Statistical analysis conducted after the war showed that frontal attack losses dropped dramatically after the Chin turret's introduction. While variables like fighter escort and flak suppression also played a role, the turret's contribution was undeniable. The hidden success of the YB-40 program lay not in the missions flown, but in the seeds planted within engineers and crews who learned to innovate and adapt quickly. The war was won by incremental improvements layered upon each other, and the gunship's failure became one such layer. They noted that the Chin turret proved remarkably effective at deterring frontal attacks. German pilots who had previously exploited the unprotected 12 o'clock position found themselves facing a rotating turret that could track them all the way through a head-on pass. Within months, Bendix's Chin turrets were installed on the last 86 B-17F aircraft and became standard on the B-17G model. The B-17G also adopted the staggered waist gun positions first tested on the YB-40, giving waist gunners more space to operate without interfering with each other. Engineers at the Cheyenne Modification Center redesigned the tail gunner's position, enlarging the windows and improving the mount based on feedback from YB-40 gunners who complained about limited visibility. The resulting Cheyenne tail became another hallmark of the B-17G series. These innovations, born from a failed escort bomber, dramatically improved bomber survivability. The addition of the Chin turret alone reduced frontal attack losses by a significant percentage across all bomb groups, saving countless crews from head-on assaults. By the time production ended in April 1945, 8,680 B-17G aircraft had rolled off assembly lines, each carrying the legacy of the YB-40's experiments. These aircraft flew more than 290,000 combat sorties and dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs. Their crews protected by features that originated with a failed idea. Robert Doolin never flew another YB-40 after his 7th mission. He transitioned back to standard B-17Fs, and on August 12, 1943, his aircraft was shot down near Gelsenkirchen after flak and fighters crippled it. He crashed in Holland and evaded for weeks before being captured. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in Stalag Luft III, the same camp made famous by the Great Escape. During long, cold nights behind barbed wire, he often thought about the heavy gunship that couldn't keep up and the lessons hidden within its failure. Decades later, Doolin wrote that he believed the YB-40 project's greatest contribution was not the missions it flew, but the innovations it inspired. When he visited the National Museum of the United States Air Force after the war and stood beneath a gleaming B-17G Chin turret, he felt a wave of pride for the men who had flown the flying destroyers into harm's way to prove a concept that did not work. He remembered the smell of burning oil, the vibration of 16 guns firing at once, the cold fear of falling behind, and the warmth of comradeship inside a metal tube crossing hostile skies. Above all, he remembered that innovation often begins with failure, and that even a broken idea can sow the seeds of success if people are willing to learn from it. The story of the YB-40 is not a tale of triumph in the traditional sense. It is a story of engineers and airmen grappling with urgent needs, making bold choices, and discovering the limits of technology under fire. German pilots did indeed marvel at a flying fortress bristling with 16 guns as it fired back at them, but they also quickly discovered its fatal weakness. Those twin truths make the narrative more human and, in a sense, more inspiring than a simple victory. In the final analysis, the gunship that fell behind gave birth to the bomber that could defend itself and still keep up with its formation. Thousands of airmen owe their lives to a project that seemed like a failure at the time, and thousands more have forgotten how that innovation came to be. If this story moved you, please click like and share a comment, telling us where you're watching from. Every interaction helps to keep the memory of brave crews like Robert Doolin's alive and ensures that forgotten stories find new audiences. We rescue lost history every day, turning dusty records into living narratives. After liberation in 1945, Doolin returned to a United States that had changed while he was imprisoned. He married his childhood sweetheart, studied engineering on the GI Bill, and told stories about the war only when asked. He often described the YB-40 missions as defining moments, times when he felt the full weight of responsibility to his crewmates. Those missions taught him humility and respect for the engineers and mechanics who kept aircraft flying. In his later years, Doolin wrote a memoir for his family, including the story of Boston Tea Party and the lessons hidden within its hull. He emphasized that failure can be the crucible in which future success is forged. He taught his grandchildren to appreciate history, to ask questions, and to look beyond headlines for the human stories beneath. When they watched war films, he pointed out details like the Chin turret, explaining how a small piece of metal could change lives. At home, Doolin kept a small piece of aluminum from the YB-40 as a paperweight on his desk. It served as a daily reminder that even experiments that don't succeed can leave durable marks on the world. If this story moved you, please Please like and comment where you are watching from. Your engagement helps us rescue forgotten stories and honor those who risked everything. Our community thrives on remembering and learning, turning failure into inspiration and keeping the voices of the past alive. The story of the flying destroyer reminds us that progress is rarely a straight line, and that even missteps can guide us toward better solutions. Innovation thrives when people are willing to take risks and learn from failure, traits embodied by the YB-40 crews. For historians and enthusiasts today, combing through mission reports and faded photographs is an act of resurrection. Each detail uncovered adds texture to the narrative and honors the sacrifices behind technical diagrams and statistics. The men who flew these missions were not thinking about posterity. They were thinking about survival and about their comrades to their left and right. Only later did they realize that their experiences would become lessons for future generations of aviators. As you share this story with friends or family, you become part of an unbroken chain of remembrance. Together, we ensure that the courage, ingenuity, and resilience of past generations continue to inspire hope and curiosity in the present. By watching and engaging, you join a community dedicated to honoring those who faced impossible odds and teaching future generations the value of perseverance and learning from failure. The guns of the YB-40 are silent now, the metal scrapped and scattered, but the ideas forged in those few months still guard the memories of those who flew through flak and fighter attacks in defense of freedom. Let's make sure their voices are not forgotten.